Well, to talk more on the Syrian crisis and the political steps to overcome it, I'm joined live now by Marcus Papadopoulos. He's editor of the magazine Politics First. President Assad has said he's not willing to negotiate with those opposition groups which he sees as the puppets of the West. Who's he talking about exactly here?
So when President Assad says he's not going to talk to the opposition, he's referring to the armed opposition, the so-called Free Syrian Army, and its political wing, the Syrian National Council, which is a foreign-based opposition movement. And it's very important to make this clear, in particular for Western audiences who are unfortunately not fed the full picture when it comes to Syria. The Free Syrian Army is a lethal cocktail of various groups, including many Islamist groups and many groups linked to Al-Qaeda. And the Free Syrian Army is, of course, backed by certain countries in the West, most notably America, and certain countries in the region, most notably Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. And the Free Syrian Army, or the FSA as it's more commonly referred to, has been responsible for heinous, vile terrorist acts in the last couple of years in Syria. The most recent, of course, was a petrol station bombing a few days ago, which resulted in the deaths of about a dozen Syrian civilians, including children. So it's pretty clear why President Assad will not talk to the armed opposition and its political wing.
And the political wing being the Syrian National Coalition, which of course is influenced by the EU and the US. So who is there left to talk to then, if much of the opposition is influenced by the West? Who does he talk to next then?
This is another important point to clarify, because once again, many lay people in the West, through no fault of their own, are not aware of the situation in Syria. There is a domestic opposition, parties which want to see political change in Syria, but they do not support extremist groups, Islamist groups, for example, which reside in the Syrian National Council and also in the Free Syrian Army. Now, the domestic Syrian opposition have made it very clear from the start, yes, they want change, but they want to work with President Assad and the Syrian government, the only legitimate force, the only legitimate authorities in Syria.
He is still refusing to recognise that there is a genuine uprising amongst the Syrian people and is instead blaming terrorists. Is he totally right with that view?
What's happening in Syria at the moment, it is largely an Islamist uprising, an uprising which is being backed once again by certain Western countries. Now, it's absolutely legitimate to call for change within a country, but you cannot take weapons and bring about change in that way by killing innocent civilians. And of course, what we're seeing is once again what happened in Afghanistan in the 1980s, when America, for example, backed the Mujahideen against the Soviet army, and we in the West were told that the Mujahideen, including Osama bin Laden, were freedom fighters. And then, of course, things go wrong with 9/11. So it's perfectly acceptable for President Assad to refer to the armed opposition in Syria as terrorists. But
Marcus,
of course, he's made it very clear he wants to negotiate with the domestic opposition in Syria.
Marcus, just briefly, he's made it very clear that he was addressing the Syrian people, but much of the international community has dismissed his speech as saying, well, he hasn't really changed his tune since the conflict started 2 years ago. He hasn't said anything different. But do you think this speech could perhaps bring about some sort of positive change for the Syrian people?
I don't think any speech by any leader in the world, be it President Assad, be it President Obama, will bring about an end to a terrible, terrible war. What will bring it to an end will be the cessation of funding and channeling weapons and cash to the militants in Syria who are causing terrible, terrible havoc, mayhem, and who are bringing about terrible casualties in Syria. So President Assad's speech has clarified the situation. He's made it very clear what he will do, and he's made it very clear who's responsible for the conflict. But ultimately, it's got to be America, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar. They've got to stop supporting militants, people who are, ideologically speaking, the same people who brought about the terrible attacks in New York, Washington, London, Madrid and Bali.
Marcus Papadopoulos, editor of magazine Politics First, thanks very much indeed for sharing your thoughts with us here live on RT.